In the spring of 1945, Berlin stood at the intersection of military collapse and civilian fear. For more than 3 years, the war on the Eastern Front had been shaped by policies that blurred the line between combat and terror. German occupation in the Soviet Union brought executions, starvation, and mass killings of civilians and prisoners of war. Soviet statistics recorded millions of civilian deaths in occupied territories, and entire regions of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia had been devastated. These experiences formed the background against which Red Army soldiers advanced toward the German capital. By April 1945, the Soviet Union had committed 3 major fronts to the final offensive in the Berlin region. With roughly 2.5 million personnel, around 6,000 armoured vehicles, and more than 40,000 artillery pieces and mortars, opposing them were approximately 1 million German troops of Army Group Vistula and Army Group Center, Berlin garrison formations, SS units, and hastily raised Volkssturm battalions. The German state apparatus was disintegrating, but propaganda continued to depict the conflict as a struggle for national survival, warning of Soviet revenge if the capital fell. Inside Berlin, about 2.7 million civilians remained in early 1945, a majority of them women, children, and elderly men. Years of bombing had already destroyed large parts of the city, disrupted food supply, and overwhelmed hospitals. Civil defense measures focused on air raids, not on the prospect of ground combat and occupation. Many families had relatives at the front, or missing rumors about the conduct of troops on all sides circulated through shelters and apartment blocks. But reliable information about the Red Army was scarce. On the Soviet side, political leadership framed the advance into Germany as both a strategic necessity and a form of historical redress. Official rhetoric emphasized the destruction of Nazism and the punishment of war criminals, while stressing discipline and the honor of the Red Army. At the same time, frontline soldiers carried personal memories of villages burned, relatives killed, and comrades executed after capture. Letters, diaries, and military reports show a mixture of duty, desire for revenge, fatigue, and expectations of reward for survival through long campaigns. The institutional context of the Soviet security system also shaped what would happen in occupied territory. The NKVD oversaw filtration of prisoners, counterintelligence, and rear area security. Soviet military regulations formally prohibited looting and violence against civilians in Allied and neutral states, and later orders extended these rules to German territory. However, enforcement depended on commanders, political officers, and military tribunals that were already burdened by desertion cases, discipline violations, and the practical demands of rapid operations. Within the German leadership, calculations about the defense of Berlin rarely considered the specific fate of civilians beyond broad appeals to hold out Adolf Hitler, and his circle demanded continued resistance, expecting that fractures among the Allies or new weapons might change the course of the war attempts by some German officials to surrender local areas or negotiate partial capitulation were discouraged or punished. This environment limited organized efforts to evacuate women and children once Soviet forces reached the Oder line. In the final weeks before the assault on Berlin, the combination of structural violence on the Eastern Front, the breakdown of German state authority, and the enormous scale of the Soviet offensive created conditions in which civilian protection mechanisms were extremely weak. Hospitals lacked supplies, police structures were collapsing, and most able-bodied German men were in uniform or dead. These preconditions set the stage for the entry of the Red Army into Berlin, where victory, occupation, and the vulnerability of civilians would converge in a compressed period of time. On 16 April 1945, the Red Army began its final offensive toward Berlin along a front more than 300 kilometers wide. The First Belarusian Front attacked across the Oder and Neisse rivers, while the First Ukrainian Front advanced from the south. In the following 10 days, Soviet formations broke through German defences at Silo Heights and pushed westward. By 21st April, forward units of 3rd Shock Army and 5th Shock Army entered the northeastern districts of Berlin, bringing ground combat into the city limits for the first time. Inside Berlin, the transition from siege to street fighting changed civilian life within hours. Artillery bombardments intensified, tram lines stopped, and water and electricity failed in many neighbourhoods. Police units, fire brigades, and civil defence organisations operated under severe strain. National Socialist officials encouraged residents to remain, promising that the city would be held and that discipline would prevail. At the same time, some local administrators and factory directors began to disappear, leaving gaps in authority at district level. The first systematic contacts between Red Army troops and Berlin civilians occurred as Soviet units moved along major roads and tram lines, clearing resistance points house by house. Infantry, tank crews, and attached engineer units entered cellars and shelters to search for combatants and weapons. Many of the men they encountered were Volkssturm members or soldiers trying to discard uniforms. Women and children emerged as non-combatants in a battle zone whose rules were unclear. Language barriers, the lack of interpreters, and mutual fear shaped these encounters. Evidence from medical records suggests that sexual violence appeared early in this phase. In several hospitals, including the charity and church-run clinics in central districts, physicians and nurses later reported a sharp increase in women seeking treatment for injuries, infections, and trauma associated with assault in the last 10 days of April and the first half of May. Some estimates based on these records and parish reports indicate that tens of thousands of women were affected in the city, with some historians extrapolating more than 100,000 cases over a period of weeks. On the Soviet side, the first days in Berlin combined combat operations, search for supplies, and improvised rest periods for troops who had been fighting almost continuously since January. Many units had suffered high casualties. Some rifle regiments were reduced to a fraction of their authorized strength. Commanders focused on maintaining momentum toward the city center, securing bridges, and coordinating with armored formations. Political departments distributed leaflets about behavior in Germany, but direct supervision of small groups of soldiers in ruined streets and basements was limited. Information about these events also comes from German survivor testimony, recorded in diaries, later interviews, and court statements. These sources describe a range of experiences. Some women reported being raped by individual soldiers or groups, sometimes repeatedly. Others described encounters in which Red Army personnel provided food, established guard posts to prevent further abuses, or helped move wounded civilians to aid stations. The variety of accounts reflects differences between units, commanders, and local circumstances. For the Soviet command structure, reports from Berlin initially focused on operational progress rather than conduct towards civilians. Front headquarters transmitted situation updates about captured districts, destroyed German units, and prisoner numbers. Only gradually did complaints about looting and violence reach higher levels, often filtered through military prosecutors, NKVD organs, or political officers. In these early days, the mechanisms that might have limited sexual violence were competing with the priorities of finishing the battle and stabilizing a devastated urban area under new control. Strategic planning for the capture of Berlin combined military objectives with political and symbolic aims. For the Soviet leadership, taking the German capital before Western Allied forces was a priority. The Stavka envisaged encircling the city, destroying remaining Wehrmacht formations, and forcing unconditional surrender. The operation was also meant to demonstrate the strength of the Soviet state to both domestic and foreign audiences. Orders to the First Belarusian and First Ukrainian fronts emphasized speed, coordination, and the raising of the Soviet flag over central government buildings as visible proof of victory. Within this framework, the question of how troops should behave toward the German population appeared in regulations but did not dominate operational planning. Soviet field manuals and political directives specified that discipline, respect for Allied property, and avoidance of unnecessary violence were expected, but Germany was defined as the aggressor state responsible for devastation in the USSR in 1945. The contrast between general instructions to maintain order and the lived experience of soldiers shaped by years of destructive warfare created an internal tension in the command system. Lavrenti Beria, as head of the NKVD, oversaw organs responsible for security in the rear, filtration of prisoners, and control of occupied territories. NKVD units advanced behind combat formations, tasked with identifying Nazi officials, Gestapo personnel, and suspected saboteurs. Planning documents focused on disarming the population, registering inhabitants, and securing administrative buildings, communication centres, and industrial sites. There is limited evidence of detailed NKVD planning that specifically addressed sexual violence as a separate category of offence during the Berlin operation. Instead, such acts fell under broader definitions of looting, violence against civilians, and breaches of discipline. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding 1st Belarusian Front, and other front commanders issued orders on the eve of the offensive that combined strict demands for combat performance with appeals to maintain discipline. Political departments circulated leaflets reminding soldiers that their behaviour in Germany would reflect on the Soviet Union as a whole. At the same time, commanders recognised that troops expected material rewards. After years at the front, regulations permitted the sending home of war trophies within prescribed limits, and rear services organised collection points for captured equipment and goods. On the German side, strategic planning for the defence of Berlin did not include systematic arrangements for the protection or evacuation of civilians once the Soviet breakthrough became imminent. Hitler and the military leadership concentrated on holding key approaches and preventing contact between Soviet and Western Allied forces. Orders to fight to the end limited the possibility of negotiating local capitulations that might have reduced the duration of urban combat. While some individuals in the Foreign Office and municipal administration sought channels to contact Western commanders, these efforts did not produce a coordinated plan for civilian safety in sectors expected to fall to the Red Army. Soviet military justice formed a potential instrument for addressing crimes committed by soldiers during the advance. Front-level and army-level tribunals already operated to prosecute desertion, self-inflicted wounds, and insubordination. Preparations for the Berlin offensive included instructions to maintain tribunal activity and to attach military prosecutors to major formations entering German territory. In practice, these bodies relied on reports from unit commanders, NKVD officers, and political workers to identify cases. Their effectiveness in preventing or punishing sexual violence depended on the willingness of superiors to treat such acts as serious offences during a period when the primary goal remained the rapid defeat of remaining German forces. Propaganda on both sides contributed to the mental environment in which planning took place. Soviet wartime publications had for years highlighted German crimes in occupied Soviet regions, often using detailed descriptions of shootings, burnings, and deportations. Although central authorities occasionally moderated the most inflammatory language, the cumulative effect reinforced among many soldiers the idea of a moral debt owed by Germany. German propaganda, for its part, warned of Soviet brutality, encouraging continued resistance, but also heightening civilian fear. When these two streams of perception met on the streets of Berlin, command-level instructions on discipline operated within a landscape of expectations that formal planning had only partially addressed. When Soviet and German forces first met inside the streets of Berlin, the city became a sequence of isolated strongpoints rather than a continuous front. From 21st to 25th April 1945, Red Army units advanced along main arteries such as Frankfurter Allee, Landsberger Allee, and the axis toward Alexanderplatz, while German defenders held key intersections, bridges, and government districts. Kampfgruppen composed of remnants from Wehrmacht divisions, SS units, police, and Volkssturm fought from upper floors and cellars, using Panzerfausts and machine guns to delay tanks and infantry. For civilians, the boundary between combat and occupation shifted block by block. In one street, heavy fighting and artillery fire dominated. In the next, resistance had collapsed, and Soviet patrols moved among damaged buildings. Many residents remained in basements for days, emerging only when soldiers appeared at cellar doors. Some tried to signal non-combatant status with white sheets or armbands. Others hid in attics, hoping to avoid direct contact. The availability of men in uniform, local Nazi officials, or police to mediate was highly uneven, depending on how long German troops continued to resist in each sector. The first waves of sexual violence often coincided with the moment when organized German defense in a neighborhood ended. Groups of Red Army soldiers searching for weapons, alcohol, and food encountered large numbers of women in confined spaces. Survivor testimony describes situations in which several soldiers entered a cellar, demanded watches or valuables, and then selected women to take into adjoining rooms or corridors. In some buildings, this occurred once. In others, different groups returned over successive days, producing repeated assaults on the same individuals. Hospital and clinic records capture the medical trace of these first encounters. In April and early May, physicians at major institutions such as the Charité and the Elizabeth Hospital noted a rapid increase in women presenting with injuries to the genital area, bruises, and symptoms of shock. Many arrived in groups, escorted by relatives or other women, sometimes after walking long distances because tram lines were no longer operating contemporary notes, where they survive, often use general terms such as violated or maltreated. But the clustering of cases in the period immediately following Soviet entry into particular districts indicates a strong temporal link to the first days of occupation. Soviet soldiers themselves experienced this phase under conditions of extreme stress and rapid movement. Accounts from diaries and post-war interviews mention long marches, high casualties, and the sudden availability of shelter, alcohol, and goods in German homes after months of deprivation. Some soldiers describe participation in or observation of sexual violence. Others wrote about attempts by officers or older comrades to prevent abuses, including placing guards at cellar entrances or ordering civilians to stay together under supervision. These differing experiences reflect the diversity of unit cultures and individual attitudes within a vast conscript army. German male civilians and remaining officials reacted in various ways when the first assaults occurred. Some tried to negotiate with Soviet patrols, offering food, watches, or information in exchange for leaving women unmolested. Others moved wives, daughters, or patients between locations, hoping that hospitals, churches, or known command posts would offer more protection. There are also documented cases in which German clergy or medical staff attempted to intervene directly, sometimes successfully persuading officers to withdraw soldiers from specific buildings, sometimes failing to prevent repeated assaults. The character of the first engagements thus combined organized urban warfare with immediate, often chaotic interactions between armed men and an unprotected civilian population. Territorial control changed rapidly, and formal Soviet regulations on discipline had limited effect at the level of small groups searching ruined houses. In this environment, sexual violence emerged as one of several forms of behavior that accompanied the transition from combat to occupation, leaving patterns that can be traced through medical data, legal records, and personal testimonies from both sides. As Soviet control extended over more districts of Berlin in late April and early May 1945, the scale of contact between troops and civilians increased and patterns of violence became more visible. Once major combat operations shifted toward the central government quarter, large residential areas in the outer and middle rings of the city lay under Soviet occupation with only limited oversight. In these sectors, multiple testimonies describe a phase in which sexual assaults, looting, and coercion were frequent, particularly during the evenings and nights when small groups of soldiers moved between houses without direct supervision by officers. Medical and parish records from several Berlin boroughs point to a concentrated wave of sexual violence over roughly 2 weeks after the first Soviet units entered the city. Physicians later recalled that many of the women they treated had been assaulted more than once, sometimes by men from different units on successive days. Age distribution in these accounts is broad, ranging from adolescents to elderly women, reflecting the demographic structure of a city where many younger men were absent at the front or dead post-war estimates by German doctors and researchers, extrapolating from local data to the city as a whole. Proposed figures of more than 100,000 women affected in Berlin during this period, while acknowledging that exact numbers cannot be established because many cases were never formally reported. Within Red Army ranks, the same days were marked by an abrupt transition from continuous offensive operations to irregular routines of guard duty, billeting, and rest in urban quarters. Soldiers often lived in requisitioned apartments, factories, or schools, sharing space with civilians. In this setting, alcohol from cellars, captured food stocks, and the absence of familiar disciplinary structures contributed to a volatile environment. Diaries and later statements by Soviet veterans indicate that some saw the opportunity to take revenge for events in the occupied Soviet Union, explicitly linking their actions in Germany to memories of earlier German behavior in their home regions. Others expressed discomfort or disapproval, noting that abuses damaged relations with civilians and undermined the image of the Red Army. The escalation of incidents produced a growing number of complaints and reports that eventually reached higher Soviet command levels. NKVD detachments, military prosecutors, and political officers documented cases of robbery, violence, and sexual assault, usually when they resulted in public disorder, resistance, or death. In some instances, German civilians approached Soviet officers, chaplains, or interpreters to report repeated assaults or request protection. Where such appeals coincided with the presence of disciplined units or commanders concerned about order, measures were sometimes taken, including assigning guards to certain buildings or moving problematic subunits to other areas. At the same time, Soviet military tribunals in the Berlin area continued to function. Archival records show that soldiers were tried and sentenced for crimes against civilians, including rape, often under articles dealing with violence against the population or banditry. Penalties ranged from terms in penal companies to execution. However, the number of documented prosecutions, when set against post-war estimates of the scale of sexual violence, indicates that only a fraction of cases resulted in formal legal action. Many offences remained unreported, were handled informally within units, or were not prioritised by commanders focused on concluding operations and stabilising supply. The role of senior figures such as Beria and Zhukov in this phase can be traced mainly through orders and subsequent recollections. Beria's NKVD apparatus concentrated on political and security tasks, and surviving instructions from this period emphasize arrests of Nazi functionaries, control of communication lines, and suppression of looting in general terms, rather than targeted directives on sexual crimes. Zhukov and other front commanders issued orders forbidding arbitrariness and violence against civilians, sometimes after receiving reports from political departments and Allied observers. These orders led to visible disciplinary actions in some areas, including public shootings of soldiers convicted of robbery or rape, but their application across all formations in Berlin was uneven. For the German population, the crisis phase combined the end of organized combat with a breakdown of familiar legal protections. The municipal police system had largely ceased to function, and the new Soviet administration was still in the process of forming women seeking medical help or legal redress, often relied on improvised networks of clergy, doctors, and remaining local officials. In some districts, the presence of clearly identified Soviet command posts and field hospitals provided relatively safer zones. In others, the absence of stable authority structures meant that patterns of abuse persisted until units rotated out or new discipline measures took effect. Internationally, news of conditions in Berlin emerged only slowly. Allied journalists and liaison officers who entered the city after its formal capitulation on May 2nd encountered a population dealing with severe shortages of food, water, and housing, as well as the consequences of recent violence. Their reports, combined with refugee accounts, contributed to early external awareness of sexual assaults. But in the immediate weeks after the battle, the primary crisis remained internal to the interaction between Soviet forces and the German civilian population in a city undergoing rapid political and administrative transformation. The peak of the Berlin fighting and the height of sexual violence overlapped in the final days of April and the first half of May 1945. Militarily, Soviet forces concentrated on encircling and reducing the central government district by 28 April. Units of 3rd Shock Army and 8th Guards Army were closing in on the Reichstag and the Ministry's quarter, while 1st Ukrainian Front cut off remaining routes to the south, and West German combat power in the city was fragmenting into isolated pockets. Yet localized resistance around strongpoints such as the Zoo Bunker, Anhalter Bahnhof, and the Charlottenburg district continued to produce casualties on both sides. In this phase, Soviet high command decisions aimed at ending organized resistance quickly. Orders emphasized the capture of specific objectives, including the Reichstag, the Chancellery, and key bridges over the Spree. Artillery concentrations were brought to bear on narrow zones, and infantry were instructed to bypass minor resistance when possible. As German forces in Berlin capitulated on May 2nd, the Red Army shifted from combat operations to securing key infrastructure, disarming remaining troops, and establishing contact lines with Western Allied units approaching from the west. For Berlin's civilians, the same days marked an intense and compressed sequence of experiences. In districts where fighting continued, movement remained dangerous. In others, the absence of organized German authority and the incomplete establishment of Soviet administration created a vacuum. Numerous accounts indicate that sexual assaults often occurred at night or during periods when patrols were least supervised. Some women reported being assaulted repeatedly over several nights until particular units moved away. New command posts were set up, or explicit protective arrangements were made by Soviet officers or medical institutions. Hospitals and improvised medical points reached their own peak of activity in this period. Alongside wounded soldiers and civilians, they now treated large numbers of women for injuries and infections associated with rape. Some institutions organized separate wards or consultation hours for these cases to manage volume and maintain privacy. Pharmaceutical shortages limited treatment options, particularly for venereal diseases and unwanted pregnancies. Medical staff made decisions about record keeping, sometimes using general terms or omitting details to reduce future stigma while still documenting the need for care. Within the Red Army, command structures gradually responded to the situation as reports accumulated. Political departments relayed complaints about looting and violence, including sexual offences, to Army and Front headquarters. Where Soviet command posts were firmly established, some issued local orders prohibiting soldiers from entering certain buildings without authorization, or required weapons to be left at guard posts before visiting civilian quarters. Military patrols in some sectors began to detain or disarm intoxicated soldiers and return them to units or to NKVD custody. At the same time, the number of cases reaching Soviet military tribunals in the Berlin area increased. Archival material from 1945 shows proceedings against soldiers charged with rape, often combined with robbery or armed threats. Sentences could be severe, including death, particularly when crimes resulted in fatal injuries or public disorder. However, the aggregate number of prosecuted cases remained limited in comparison to post-war estimates of the overall scope of sexual violence, reflecting both underreporting and the constraints of a judicial system operating in a recently captured, heavily damaged city. For many Soviet soldiers, the peak of the campaign mixed a sense of victory with exposure to conditions in the German capital. Letters and memoirs describe impressions of ruins, underground shelters, and the contrast between wartime deprivation on the Eastern Front and the material goods found in Berlin apartments. Some expressed pride in victory and sympathy for civilians. Others justified harsh behavior as retribution for events in the Soviet Union. These divergent reactions coexisted within the same formations, influencing local patterns of interaction. By the time formal German military resistance in Berlin had ended, the pattern of sexual violence was already established. In the days immediately following capitulation, assaults continued in many districts, even as Soviet administrative structures began to solidify and as certain commanders implemented stricter discipline. The peak of the campaign thus combined decisive military operations with a parallel phenomenon of widespread civilian victimization, recorded not only in survivor testimony, but also in medical data and Soviet legal files that capture a fragment of the broader reality. Resistance and adaptation in Berlin after the capitulation took multiple forms among both civilians and occupying forces. As Soviet authority consolidated from early to mid-May 1945, patterns of behavior shifted from the most chaotic phase toward more regulated interactions, although experiences differed significantly between districts. In some neighborhoods, the arrival of stable command posts, field hospitals, and administrative offices coincided with a decrease in uncontrolled movement by armed patrols. In others, repeated unit rotations and weak supervision allowed previous practices to continue for longer. Many German women and families developed strategies aimed at reducing exposure to further assaults. Survivor accounts describe efforts to stay in groups, to move into buildings that house Soviet headquarters, or to seek shelter in hospitals, churches, and convents where officers had placed guards. Some women entered into arrangements with individual Soviet soldiers or officers, exchanging regular access, domestic work, or companionship for a measure of protection against others. These relationships, sometimes described in sources as protection connections, reflected attempts to create predictable frameworks within an unstable environment. Medical institutions adapted their procedures to increasing demand. Hospitals and outpatient clinics organized special consultation hours, often in the mornings, for women seeking treatment after rape. Some physicians provided pragmatic advice on how to reduce risks during encounters with soldiers and attempted, within the limits of available supplies, to offer prophylaxis against venereal diseases and pregnancy. In the following months, Berlin doctors recorded significant numbers of abortions related to assaults in April and May, sometimes noting these circumstances in case histories, sometimes not. The psychological impact on civilians prompted various forms of internal resistance. Diaries and parish notes mention collective decisions within families or groups of women to avoid certain streets, to change clothing to appear older, or to cut hair short. In some cases, women attempted to arm themselves with improvised weapons or to threaten self-harm to deter attackers. There are documented instances of suicide by women and men who perceived no acceptable way to protect themselves or their relatives from repeated assaults. Although precise numbers are difficult to establish, local reports in some parishes speak of noticeable increases in suicides during and shortly after the occupation phase. On the Soviet side, adaptation involved both formal and informal measures. Commanders at regiment, division, and army level issued orders tightening discipline, restricting alcohol consumption, limiting unauthorized movement in civilian areas, and clarifying penalties for crimes against the population. Political officers were instructed to conduct discussions with soldiers on behavior in Germany, linking discipline to the international reputation of the Soviet Union and to the need for cooperation with Allied authorities. In some units, officers placed mixed patrols and checkpoints at key intersections to control traffic and reduce unregulated contact. NKVD and military prosecutor organs adjusted their practices as well. As administrative structures stabilized, they were better able to register complaints, investigate cases, and bring charges before tribunals. Reports from summer 1945 include more systematic references to crimes against civilians, including rape, lootings, and unauthorized use of firearms. Punishments, once imposed, sometimes had demonstrative functions. Public postings of tribunal sentences, or executions, carried out in view of troops, were intended to deter further offences and to signal a change from wartime permissiveness to peacetime order. Not all Soviet personnel responded in the same way. Some officers and soldiers actively supported measures to protect civilians, viewing them as necessary for long-term occupation tasks and for their own security. Others regarded restrictions as excessive or as disregarding their expectations of compensation for hardships endured during the war. This divergence is visible in complaints sent to higher command levels about strict discipline, as well as in cases where units with poor records were transferred away from sensitive urban sectors to reduce friction. Over time, informal arrangements between civilians and members of the occupying forces became part of everyday life in Berlin. Women who worked as translators, cleaners, or cooks in Soviet offices and quartering locations often gained more ability to negotiate conditions or to seek assistance when problems arose. At the neighborhood level, local German administrators, newly appointed under Soviet supervision, began to mediate between residents and military authorities, forwarding collective petitions and helping to resolve disputes over billeting and conduct. By late summer 1945, these processes of resistance and adaptation had begun to change the immediate environment in which sexual violence occurred. While assaults did not cease completely, their frequency and pattern shifted as Soviet units rotated, as formal discipline mechanisms became more consistent, and as German civilians and local authorities gained experience interacting with occupation structures. The memory of the peak period in April and May, however, remained a central reference point in personal and communal narratives, shaping how subsequent events and policies were perceived by those who had endured the first weeks of Soviet rule in Berlin. The turning point in the story of Berlin in 1945 did not come with a single order or event, but through the convergence of military, political, and documentary processes that began to reframe what had happened during the first weeks of occupation. Militarily, the shift from combat to administration was largely complete by late May. Front headquarters reoriented toward demobilization planning, redeployment, and the division of occupation zones with Western partners. As units moved out of the city or were reassigned, their direct contact with Berlin civilians declined, and new formations with rear area and garrison functions assumed responsibility for order. At the political level, Soviet leadership increasingly focused on the international implications of conduct in Germany, the need to cooperate with Western Allied commands in matters such as prisoner exchanges, supply, and division of responsibilities along the demarcation line brought behavior in occupied areas under closer scrutiny. Reports from liaison officers, as well as Western journalistic accounts, mentioned looting and violence against civilians, including sexual assaults. While such reports were filtered through wider political competition, they contributed to Stavka and NKVD awareness that discipline in occupation zones had foreign policy consequences. Within the Soviet system, this awareness intersected with existing instruments of control. Beria received information not only from security organs in Berlin, but also from internal party channels and diplomatic reporting. Surviving documentation indicates that his apparatus responded by reinforcing general instructions against looting and arbitrary violence stressing the need to present Soviet authority as orderly and predictable. This did not produce a comprehensive policy response to sexual violence as a distinct category, but it formed part of a broader shift from wartime permissiveness toward peacetime regulation of troop behavior. Marshal Zhukov, as commander of the Soviet occupation zone in Germany, became a key figure in implementing this shift on the ground. Orders issued under his authority in summer 1945 placed greater emphasis on protecting property, regulating interactions with civilians, and punishing crimes that could undermine relations with the German population or with Allied commands. Military tribunals in the zone, including those in Berlin, continued to try cases involving rape alongside other offences such as robbery and unauthorised use of weapons. In some garrisons, officers were instructed to report all serious incidents involving civilians, including sexual assaults, directly to higher headquarters. For German society, the same period marked the beginning of systematic efforts to record and interpret what had occurred. Local administrations, churches, and medical institutions started compiling reports on damage, mortality, and social conditions. In some parishes and hospitals, notes on suicides, unwanted pregnancies, and cases treated after sexual assault were included in broader summaries submitted to municipal or regional authorities. These documents did not yet form a coordinated narrative, but they laid the groundwork for later statistical and historical analyses. On the level of individual memory, a turning point came as the immediate danger receded and space for reflection emerged. Diaries written by Berlin residents in summer 1945 often contrast recollections of the first weeks of occupation with observations of a more regular pattern of life returning, such as the reopening of markets, schools, and public transport. References to rape and other forms of violence coexist with entries on food shortages, housing problems, and the arrival of Western Allied patrols in certain sectors. In this way, sexual violence became one element in a broader catalogue of wartime and post-war experiences. Western Allied observers contributed another perspective to this evolving picture. Officers of United States, British, and French forces who visited or operated in Berlin reported on the condition of civilians and on relations between the population and Soviet troops. Their accounts, together with refugee testimonies from other parts of Eastern Germany, fed into early public discussions in Western countries about the conduct of the Red Army. These discussions were shaped by emerging political tensions, but they also drew attention to the question of whether large-scale sexual violence should be understood as a byproduct of war, as a war crime, or as a mixture of both. Inside the Soviet Union, the same events were largely absent from public discourse. Official media celebrated the victory, highlighted the role of the Red Army in defeating Germany, and focused on reconstruction at home and on the establishment of friendly governments in Eastern Europe. Cases of crimes against German civilians tried by military tribunals remained classified or were reported only in internal bulletins. For Soviet soldiers and officers, the turning point thus involved a transition from open wartime talk about revenge and trophies to a framework in which such topics were rarely discussed in official settings, even while memories persisted privately. Taken together, these developments marked a shift from an environment in which sexual violence in Berlin occurred on a large scale with limited external oversight to one in which military, political, and documentary structures began to constrain, record, and interpret it. The immediate frequency of assaults declined as occupation practices stabilized, but the question of how to classify and remember the events of April and May 1945 emerged as a distinct issue, linking personal testimony, medical and legal records, and evolving national narratives on both sides of the former front line. The immediate aftermath of the Battle for Berlin combined military withdrawal, humanitarian crisis, and the first attempts to manage the consequences of recent events. After the capitulation on May 2, 1945, Organized German combat operations ceased within the city, though isolated resistance and incidents with armed individuals continued for some days. Soviet units with frontline experience were gradually redeployed eastward or to other regions of occupied Germany, while garrison and rear service formations took over routine duties. This transition reduced the intensity of direct contact between Berlin civilians and combat troops, but did not remove the effects of what had occurred. Humanitarian conditions in the city were severe. Housing destruction left hundreds of thousands without intact apartments. Water and sewage systems required repair. Food supply depended on improvised distribution and on the organization of rationing. In this context, the impact of sexual violence intersected with broader medical and social problems. German doctors in Berlin recorded rises in venereal diseases, complications from pregnancies following rape, and demand for abortions in the months after May 1945. Some hospitals and private practices noted that a significant proportion of requests for termination of pregnancy referred to assaults during the occupation period, although records often used indirect language. The demographic structure of Berlin also changed rapidly. Large numbers of German soldiers were killed, captured, or missing. In addition, refugees and expellees from eastern territories began to arrive, bringing further reports of sexual violence in rural areas and smaller towns. Municipal authorities, attempting to register population movements, had to integrate local residents, former soldiers returning from captivity, and displaced persons. Among these groups, women who had experienced rape formed a category that was not officially distinguished, but whose needs for medical, psychological, and economic support were present in everyday practice. On the Soviet side, withdrawal and rotation of units did not end legal proceedings for crimes committed in Berlin and other occupied areas. Military tribunals continued to operate, trying cases that had occurred earlier as well as new incidents. Sentences for rape and related offences contributed to internal statistics on discipline, but remained restricted to classified reports. Soviet military and political leadership evaluated the occupation in terms of general order, relations with Allied forces, and economic extraction, rather than in terms of sexual violence as a separate issue. For German institutions, the question of how to address the consequences of rape in legal and administrative terms emerged gradually. The legal system was undergoing transformation under Allied supervision, with denazification, war crimes investigations, and reconstruction of courts. In this environment, individual cases of violence by occupation troops were often handled pragmatically through liaison with Soviet or later with Western authorities, rather than through German criminal proceedings. Civil law questions, such as maintenance for children born after rape or recognition of these children in family records, had to be resolved on a case-by-case basis. At the personal level, many survivors chose not to report assaults formally. Diaries and later testimonies suggest reasons including fear of stigma, concern for marriage prospects, and the perception that legal redress against foreign soldiers was unlikely to succeed. Some women disclosed their experiences only to doctors, clergy, or close relatives. Others remained silent for decades. In families, the events of April and May 1945 were sometimes known but rarely discussed openly, becoming part of a private narrative of the war distinct from public commemoration. Internationally, discussions of the occupation of Berlin formed part of broader debates about the conduct of all belligerents. At the Nuremberg trials and subsequent proceedings, the main focus lay on major war crimes such as mass killings, forced labour, and crimes against peace. Sexual violence against German civilians by Allied troops, including those of the Soviet Union, did not feature prominently in indictments. As a result, the legal framing of these events at the immediate post-war international level remained limited. The process of withdrawal and stabilization therefore left a complex legacy. On the surface, Berlin moved from active combat through chaotic occupation into more regular administration, with functioning services and emerging political structures. Beneath this, the consequences of sexual violence persisted in health records, demographic changes, and family histories. Soviet military and security organs continued to operate according to internal regulations, while German institutions and individuals dealt with the aftermath within the constraints of occupation law and evolving Cold War alignments. The long-term legacy of the events in Berlin in April and May 1945 links military victory, large-scale sexual violence, and evolving legal and historical frameworks. The capture of the German capital became one of the central symbols of the Soviet Union's role in defeating Germany. At the same time, medical records, survivor testimony, and Soviet military tribunal files document a pattern of rape and related abuses that many later observers have discussed in terms of war crimes, even though contemporary international law and practice did not always treat sexual violence as a distinct category. In the immediate post-war Soviet narrative, public emphasis lay on liberation, sacrifice, and reconstruction. Official histories and commemorations focused on the scale of Red Army casualties, the destruction of German armed forces, and the political outcome of the war. References to crimes committed by Soviet soldiers against German civilians were absent from public discourse and, when addressed at all, remained in internal reports. Beria's security apparatus and Zhukov's occupation command issued orders and conducted prosecutions that acknowledged such crimes in practice, but did not challenge the broader public depiction of the campaign as disciplined and just. This combination of internal disciplinary measures and external silence shaped Soviet memory of Berlin for decades. In German memory, the Berlin rapes occupied a different, but also complex position. Early accounts appeared mainly in private diaries, parish reports, and confidential medical notes. In West Germany, some memoirs and literary works began to describe sexual violence in the 1950s and 1960s, often focusing on Berlin and other cities in the Soviet occupation zone. In East Germany, where public narratives emphasized anti-fascist liberation and friendship with the Soviet Union, discussion remained constrained, and many experiences were transmitted only within families or in restricted circles. Over time, historians used hospital statistics, parish documentation, and survivor interviews to refine estimates and to integrate these events into broader studies of the war's impact on civilians. Comparative research has situated the Berlin rapes within a wider pattern of sexual violence in Europe at the end of the war. American, British, and French troops also committed rapes in Germany and elsewhere, and these incidents are documented in military police and court-martial records. However, many studies note that the scale and concentration of sexual violence in the Soviet zone, including Berlin, appear significantly greater, with estimates of more than 100,000 women assaulted in Berlin and up to several 100,000 or more in Eastern Germany as a whole. These comparisons have led to debates about the role of revenge narratives, discipline structures, length of exposure to extreme violence on the Eastern Front, and differences in command responses among the various Allied forces. The question of command responsibility remains central in historical discussions. Evidence suggests that Soviet High Command, including Beria and Zhukov, received information about crimes against civilians and responded with general orders against looting and arbitrary violence, along with selected prosecutions. Historians disagree on whether these measures represented serious attempts to curb sexual violence or primarily symbolic actions aimed at maintaining overall order and international credibility. The incomplete nature of the archival record, especially regarding internal communications at top levels, leaves room for different interpretations of how far responsibility extended beyond individual perpetrators and immediate commanders. Legal and moral evaluations have also evolved. During the immediate post-war years, international tribunals concentrated on mass killings, forced labor, and aggressive war rape and other forms of sexual violence received less explicit attention, although they fell under broader categories of violations of the laws and customs of war. Later developments in international law, including tribunals in the late 20th century, recognized large-scale sexual violence as a war crime and as a possible crime against humanity. In this context, the events in Berlin have been revisited by scholars as an early example of mass sexual violence in modern warfare, even though they were not formally prosecuted in those terms at the time. For individuals and families, the legacy of the Berlin rapes has been long-term and often private. Health consequences, changes in family structures, and the presence of children conceived through rape influenced lives far beyond 1945. In recent decades, some survivors and their descendants have contributed testimonies to oral history projects, adding personal dimensions to the statistical and institutional record. These accounts, together with hospital data and Soviet tribunal documents, support ongoing efforts to reconstruct what happened in as much detail as possible without collapsing diverse experiences into a single narrative. In summary, the events in Berlin pose enduring questions about the relationship between victory and violation, about how armies manage or fail to manage the conduct of their soldiers, and about how societies remember episodes that combine military success with civilian suffering. The combination of Soviet military triumph, official denial of systematic wrongdoing, and the later accumulation of evidence from German and Soviet sources has made the Berlin rapes a focal point in broader debates over whether they should be understood, primarily as an extreme consequence of total war, as a large-scale war crime, or as a phenomenon that spans both categories.